Okay, good morning, everyone. So I think we can get started. Do we have the virtual speakers as well? Oh, but that's, yeah, okay. If you can show the videos, if they're online. Great. Hi, Christian. And I think we're meeting one speaker. Is what does that mean? What? The other one hasn't connected? Okay, let's get started, and hopefully Muad Ben Tahar can join us in a minute. Right, so good morning. I'm going to start by very briefly introducing my co-panelists, and then we'll get started. So I'm Milena Castellnou, I'm Chief Programs Officer at the Education Outcomes Fund, and very pleased to be moderating this panel today. And with me, I have Don Davar, who is head of social finance at UBS Optimus Foundation, Andrew Bird, who is the global CEO of Education for Employment, and virtually with us today, we have Christian Brandley, whom you saw on the screen a minute ago, who is the deputy head of the private sector team at the Swiss cooperation agency SECO. And we'll also have Mourad Ben Tahar, project director at MCA, Millennium Challenge Account Morocco, an agency of the Moroccan government. So thank you for joining us today. So to introduce this session, I'll start by saying that we've been speaking extensively about over the past couple of days about the learning crisis. But we're also facing another really important crisis at the moment, which is the youth unemployment crisis. And to give you, I'm not going to bore you with stats, but we're looking in the MENA region at a 25% unemployment rate amongst youth, and that can go as high as 37% in countries such as Jordan. So to face this challenge, governments and donors have been funding extensively training programs. And I think we heard about quite a few of these training programs in the previous sessions yesterday and the day before. But we know from a study from the World Bank that actually 2/3 of TVET programs have absolutely no impact on employment or income. So this is a pretty sad, I guess, kind of statistic, because it shows that all of the money that we're spending is not having the impact that we intend. And so in light of this challenge, we're looking at results-based financing as an alternative solution to increase the cost effectiveness of this program and really concretely to achieve the impact that we need for youth. So that means that they get a job and that they stay in the labor market and continue employed. So results-based financing is the very simple idea of tying funding to results. And it's not completely new. In fact, there are about 225 impact bonds, I think, to date, and about 1/3 of these are in the employment sector. So there's a lot that we can already learn about what has worked well and not so well, and that's precisely why we're here today. So I'm very pleased to be joined in this discussion by practitioners who have actually themselves all participated in this type of programs. So from the point of view of the donor, with the Swiss Cooperation Agency with Christian, of the government, with Mourad Ben Tahar from the Moroccan government, from the point of view of the investor in an impact bond with Dunn, and of the provider who's delivered a few of these programs with Andrew. So I'll pass it on to them to tell us more about their experience and share concrete examples. Let's start maybe with you in the room, since we don't have the speakers yet online. But maybe, Andrew, starting with you. So Education for Employment is one of the providers that's been really leading this sector, right? The advancement of this type of mechanism. And if I remember well, you've participated in actually 3 different types of results-based financing programs in Morocco, Jordan, and Palestine. So I'd be really curious to hear about your experience. What has attracted you to these programs? What have been the kind of concrete challenges and lessons learned in the field?
Great. No, that's right. We've been fortunate to be out and able to implement 3 different programs with kind of 3 different structures. So we've been conducting some internal stock taking of our experiences over the last few years there, and I'm really pleased to be invited to speak about those. I'm going to start with kind of brass tacks, right? How do you get paid for doing this? What is that payment mechanism? And I think one of the lessons that we've learned, particularly and we've been comparing our experiences to several other organizations implementing them as well, is that for smaller or less resourced implementers, there needs to be a payment structure which allows them to look at incremental ways of being paid. If it's all paid at the end for the outcome, you don't have the operating expenses or income cash flow to be able to implement the program at any scale. And I think one of the things that the promise of results-based financing is to get to scale, is to look at replicating models that are working. So I'll take the example of Palestine, which is probably our more extreme example in terms of how we structured it, with 6 different payment periods. So the first was youth coming into the program, starting kind of day 1, then graduating. Third was into internships or some sort of practical work experience. The fourth was leaving that, completing it. The fifth was getting employment itself. And the 6th was a retention period. So that, that seemed to work for them. That may be a lot for others, but it gives an idea of one of the ways. I think another lesson learned was, as a mission-based organization, Education for Employment is really trying to focus on working with youth who are coming from more challenging environments to find employment. And unless the results-based finance mechanism is explicitly focused on that same demographic, there might be a tendency to kind of take the cream of the crop. So what are the easiest youth to employ in order to get those numbers? And so you kind of internally have to really focus on your own mission and make sure that you're continuing to line up with that. And the last one I'll just briefly mention here is the verification of this. How do you verify that you've achieved those results? And in most cases, it's a third party that comes in to do that. And I think having flexibility around how that can be done is really important. Sometimes it sounds easy. For example, in one of our programs, it was employment contracts. The outcome was employment, so let's see the contract. A lot of organizations or individuals, turns out, don't want to share their employment contracts. And so it got to the point where they said, all right, and this was nurses that we had been doing training for, go to the hospital, take a picture of the nurse in their outfit, holding up their badge in front of the sign so we can see, and we'll take that as verification, which sounded great, except we discovered most of them were working late night shifts. So we had our team going at 11 o'clock at night to take pictures of the nurses in front. So anyway, interesting challenges, but there are always solutions.
No, very, very interesting, and I guess having been and still leading the design process of these type of programs, it's so valuable to hear about the practical realities, right, and how the devil is really in the details when it comes to actually designing this right. Dan, would you like to tell us about, so UBS Optimus Foundation has played the role of investor in a few impact bonds in employment and also in other topics, and actually really one of the leading impact investor in that space so far. What has attracted you to this space, and can you tell us a little bit more about the role of the investor?
Absolutely. So I think first and foremost, it's about the need as well as the opportunity in technical and vocational education and training. There is a huge potential in low and middle income countries. You've got large and growing youth populations that are looking for the skills to equip them to participate in the global economy. New sectors and areas coming up, information technology or the green economy. But on the other hand, you have education sector and education systems that aren't quite ready to equip these young people with the requisite skill sets to participate in these jobs. And although government and policymakers are, of course, aware of these issues. They face a separate set of challenges, competing funding priorities, healthcare or infrastructure or education. And also, it simply takes time to adapt to the new realities or adjust to the new emerging needs and trends in the space. And so that provides actually a unique opportunity for social investors to come in. So we see an potential solution with private sector funding, results-based funding, coming into at least the short and medium term to finance gaps within the skilling space. And there's huge potential, and I think it's very attractive for investors like us because there is an opportunity to create impact, really meaningful impact, but also generate near market financial returns. And that's made possible basically by the very nature of the skilling space. So you have students who have earning potential, so there's a potential revenue stream. You have employers who may be able to pay for that training. And then you have philanthropies and donors who could also provide technical assistance, bursaries, or impact incentives. So that's what makes it an interesting space for investors to come in and participate.
No, that's great. Yeah, so many different kind of, I guess, in this type of program, right? Many different actors involved, and all can come together and contribute. So the role in what we call a typical impact bond model, the role of an investor, I guess, if I can maybe summarize it, it would be addressing the need that Andrew was talking about previously around the pre-financing, but also supporting the organizations in the delivery. Is that how you would?
Absolutely. So your investor, your typical risk investor comes in, of course, with the upfront capital, but also with the performance culture, the performance management system that helps then the implementing partners to deliver the results that have been defined at the outset. Yep. Absolutely.
Great. We still don't have the other speakers, I think. Yes?
We have Christian.
We have Christian. Okay, perfect. I didn't realize that. Okay, hi Christian. Would you be able then to share your perspective? So representing SECO, the Swiss corporation here, from the donor point of view, what has interested SECO in this program? And actually, SECO has also been, we're here with like all kind of leading actors in this field who've been really, I guess, breaking the ground for others. But SECO has been the outcome funder in a few impact bonds and now an outcome fund in Colombia, and now we're potentially working together in Tunisia to set up a program of that type. So what has been attracting SECO to this?
Thanks, Milena. Good morning, everyone. Greetings from Switzerland. As a development partner, we are, of course, committed to continuously improve results, and we see this discussion of results-based financing very much framed in the context of the OECD's principles for effective development cooperation, as discussed in Paris, Busan, etc. While we already fostered an outcome orientation in our monitoring, we wanted to really test outcomes-based financing and contracting as a next step in this evolution, and where it makes sense and is feasible. And an area where we've seen that there is a lot of potential is workforce development and TVET. As you mentioned before, if you look at the meta-evaluations of these kind of programs, this area does not perform particularly well, and so there is a lot of potential to work on. And we often see also that there are quite some development partners and governments in partner countries that are supporting projects in workforce development, but often with unclear results at best. Specifically in Colombia, we worked on SIPs for integration of vulnerable people into the formal labor market, and potentially we will work the future in Tunisia. But maybe focusing a little bit on Colombia, so we started to test this approach while at the same time aiming for a long-term sustainability. Specifically, we tried to improve public procurement of social programs in Colombia, and this is only possible through a programmatic approach. Now, what does that mean? Well, the program announced and has actually supported several SIPs already, so several transactions. And additionally, it provided capacity building within the government and other actors as well as knowledge management. And so in practice, together with the Colombian government, Switzerland pays for outcomes 50-50. And the outcomes are job placement and job retention after 3 and 6 months. So we have socially motivated investors who pay for the working capital upfront. And the IDB lab is implementing the program together with Fundación Corona and Instilio as an advisor. And in the program, we also supported the government to actually establish an outcomes fund within the Ministry of Social Prosperity with its own team and structure and a budget that goes beyond the annual budget to really pay for a bit longer term results. So we actually see first indications towards an institutionalization of this approach.
Thank you. Very interesting. And actually, that's a good transition, I think, to what I would like to ask Murad, who is also on the line around the institutionalization. I don't think he's on video, but he should be on audio. So the MCA Morocco is currently implementing a program with the Minister of Labor in Morocco, which is a results-based financing program, and would be curious to hear a bit more about the program and also what its vision is in terms of particularly in terms of scalability and sustainability.
Thank you, Milena. Thank you, Milena. Excuse me, I have some trouble with the camera, so I'm only in audio. Yes, one of the employment project we are leading in this compact with the Millennium Challenge Corporation is a pilot result-based financing program with ambitious goals. In particular, to improve the employability and the job placement of at-risk youth and vulnerable women through innovative result-based financing mechanism, and also to demonstrate the relevance and the value add of RBF in the Moroccan context, particularly in the field of employment. And also another goal is to spark interest in RBF at the institutional level and helping create an ecosystem of service providers in the Moroccan employment sectors. The scale of the program is to train around 4,500 people, to place 3,500 people in employment, and to retain nearly 3,000 people over 6 consecutive months in the firms. To date, despite the effects of COVID pandemics, around 95% and 43% and 15% of training, placement, and retention objectives have been reached respectively. Now can say some challenges and success during the implementation for MCA of this pilot. The main challenges is that the launch of the program has been with more than 6 month delay to the breakout of the COVID pandemic, which has considerably reduced the achievement of results over the duration of the project. Another challenge is to achieve the long-term retention results consequently to the employment choke by main economic sectors and particularly repeat closure of firms. And also another challenge is that the vulnerability in the labor market has not only increased the unemployment youth, who bears clearly the cost of COVID, but also lower educated workers within labor shedding and displacement. Of course, this creates a large pool of labor that are more harder to be absorbed into labor markets. And maybe one of the main success is that I can say that in general, the COVID crisis has a significant impact on labor market institutions, but relatively NGOs and private actors as providers have shown a certain capacity within the flexibility given to them to adapt and react quickly to the requirement of job markets. And also the training schemes were implemented online and later by extended to face-to-face trainings once the pandemic was less restrictive. And in addition, the opportunity cost of training is reduced and provides an opportunity for low skills workers to gain new skills.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing your experience. And yes, a very challenging moment to start a program at the beginning of the pandemic. I'm very interested to hear about this capacity to adapt, because that's one of the main reasons for launching results-based financing program, is to say that if we're going to be focusing on outcomes and paying for the outcomes, we're providing more flexibility to the implementers to adapt to what is needed, and especially in changing market conditions.
Yeah.
So would love to hear from you, Andrew. Is that something you've seen in practice? Can you give us examples?
Absolutely. And just to kind of be the other side of what we just heard in Morocco, since we're one of the implementing organizations there. Yes, COVID was difficult on the employment sector, but what the mechanism allowed us to do was to reallocate resources into sectors that might be more promising now, and kind of put off those maybe until later, when the economy looked better in other sectors. And so it created a way for us to be much more efficient, I think, in the use of those resources, and really focus on the ultimate outcome, which is the employment and employment retention. And I think, in other programs we've seen too, where they are sector agnostic, it just gives a lot more flexibility. If they're very sector specific, then you can have these impacts a bit more. And I would say the other part that we really saw the flexibility and benefit to us as an implementer is on the timing, and the timing of when we bring youth into the program itself, when we start looking for the employment outcomes, because those cycles do vary, and so we have kind of a good sense when we're likely to get the participation of youth, and it doesn't always follow a typical donor cycle. And so this gives us that ability to really kind of hit those targets well.
Great, no, thank you. From your experience in Colombia, Christian, are there some lessons learned that you would like to share around what has also worked well and what has been more challenging?
Yes, sure. Generally, it is, of course, a bit more complex than setting up traditional projects because, among other reasons, you align interests of all actors ex ante. On data, which is always an issue, we were quite lucky in Colombia as we could count on social security data by the government as a reliable and cheap means of verification of the job placement and retention. And I also want to stress that one of the lessons maybe is that we got increasingly more efficient in terms of time and cost to set up the next SIP. Maybe another point is political cycles. So you have changes of governments at the national and subnational level every 4 years in Colombia. So we tried to involve different types of government actors on the national level, but also on the subnational level, but worked best in a given political cycle. So the pros were to work on the subnational level, that they're closer to the beneficiaries, the city administrations, and thus they had maybe even more interest to learn. On the downside, they might have a bit less capacity and data. But we think that in the future, ideally, we can combine this through the outcomes fund at the national level, where there can be a combination of funds from the city and the national government. So there is not just a higher effectiveness through SIPs, but also a better coordination of actions and learnings, hopefully. And this brings me maybe to the last point in terms of lessons. And I think it's the use of SIPs for learning agendas. SIPs and results-based financing as an instrument is still a bit in its infancy. Often you hear people say that they have relatively high transaction costs. And while this is partly true, and especially in a one-off transaction, we would argue to assess this question in a broader perspective. Because first, you often cannot compare traditional pay for activities to pay for results projects. It is another quality of results that you get. Second, you learn much more. For instance, we learned that there is quite a drop of people between those that graduated from the training program and those who got actually a job. And this is even more pronounced with women, while this later on stays quite flat once they are in a job, although the drop for men and women at the same level continues over time if you look at the retention. And the third reason is also that SIPs provide an opportunity to have live performance monitoring and integrate the continuous learning into government policy. So, for instance, into policy documents that the government elaborated in Colombia, also on demystifying some assumptions about how this market works. So while we've seen this in Colombia, we could have done probably even more. And so we certainly recommend everyone who is interested in setting up SIPs to establish a learning agenda ex ante and make the most out of the additional data that you get.
No, that's really interesting. Thank you. And actually, we've touched on some of the key criticisms of these type of instruments, right? The high transaction cost, or some say the kind of challenges in terms of sustainability. And is this just a one-off program that will just die after its implementation period? So really, really great to hear that in Colombia there has been such a clear path. And so I was wondering, Ministry of Employment or the placement agency around the integration of this learning into public policy?
As of course,
Muhad, can you hear us?
yes, I hear you, but
okay.
yeah, you hear me?
Yes, all good.
Okay. So I say that was important. That was the important goal for the government. Of course, scaling and sustainability of the pilot program have been surely ensured through the sustained engagement with all the relevant stakeholders at all stages of program design and implementation, and in particular with the Labor Ministry and also the Government Employment Agency called, as you said, ANAPEC. And also in parallel, we did the technical assistance to Government Employment Agency to help ensure conditions are in place so that the agency existing program can be revamped and scaled with RBF. Maybe, and also some key learnings from the pilot program have already been incorporated in the recommendation for the redesign of current programs, as well as development of an agency-wide performance management system. So close cooperation to ensure proper buy-in at all agency levels has been centerpieces to this work program. And maybe another point is technical assistance is also being carried out to other institutional actors in human development, as INDIASH, which is Moroccan agency that have for mission to inclusive program and human development. So the technical assistance is being carried out to help them to design and implement an inclusive RBF program and build their capacity on RBF design and also project implementation. So I think this is the important point that I wanted to share with you, that in terms of scaling the sustainability, the importance is also for the government to be to carry out to help them design and implement an inclusive RBF programs. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Really interesting to see that there has been already some ripple effects, right, of the program itself into some of the public policy in a wider sense. All right, I have, I guess, one more question for our panelists, and then we'd like to open the floor to to the audience if you have some questions. But before we do that, Dan, I know that results-based financing in itself is already innovative, but we do see the emergence of new models. And you've mentioned before the contribution, the financial contribution of the participants in the program, of the employers. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about looking into the future, what's next for innovative finance in the sector?
So I think that's absolutely right. Results-based financing in itself is an innovation here, and I think there are some very interesting models that we can look to as we think about the future and evolving the next. So two examples that I wanted to share were the Harambee Skilling Impact Bond in South Africa, as well as the Shansen Future of Work Fund, and they're very interesting and have very unique features, each one of them. So the Harambee Skilling Impact Bond was an impact bond in South Africa looking at youth employment and retention. It was run by an organization called Harambee that does a fantastic job with youth skilling. They're able to actually identify undersupplied areas in the South African economy and then skill up youth to be able to service those jobs. So for example, information technology in Cape Town. But what they needed was upfront capital to be able to run the initiative. Now, the impact bond actually brought together a group of partners that was very much focused on the long-term economic prospects and growth of the South African economy. And the outcome funders, interestingly here, were the South African Treasury and the Gauteng provincial government. So not the Ministry of Education, but parties that were interested in the economic prospects in South Africa. And so these parties were therefore willing to pay for skills. They were willing to pay for the outcomes, which brought a perfect alignment of stakeholders. So Harambee needed investors needed repayment, and there was the state treasury and the provincial government that were willing to make that repayment. And so the fundamental model here was extremely strong and really focused on the impact of employment as well as retention for at least 12 to 24 months for these young people in the jobs that were identified. It was unfortunately discontinued last year because of COVID and the impact that it had on the economy. But the underlying model, very strong, very interesting, and I think one certainly worth reconsidering once the pandemic is over. The other model that I wanted to share is the Shansen Future of Work Fund. So this is actually an initiative in Rwanda where we finance a student loan facility run by Shansen, and they operate through income share agreements, which I think is an interesting innovation in itself. What are income share agreements? Basically, loans provided to students to complete their education, and when the students start earning income and get jobs of a minimum salary threshold, they pay back the loan. And so they only pay back the loan when they are able to pay back. And it's very important in this model to think about that payment threshold and very carefully design the initiative so that you're not creating undue pressure, of course, on the students and not creating a damaging effect, but actually facilitating their entry into the job market. And here what's interesting, again, is the underlying revenue comes from the students. And so I think in models and looking to the future is to explore, where is there potential for revenue? Is it student repayment? Is it employer paying for training? And frame the right mechanisms around the various stakeholders and their aligned interests. And you could look to eventually transitioning off student loan books of this nature to the private sector, transitioning it to the government, or even thinking about cooperative structures for financing initiatives like these.
Very interesting, and so much potential to innovate in this area.
What I love about the income share as well is that there's often talk about job quality and not just jobs for the sake of a job.
Absolutely.
And this actually is a mechanism to help an implementer really think about the job quality because it has to meet that certain threshold for income.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I think it's a great thing to explore.
Really, really interesting. We have a few minutes left for questions from the audience. So if anyone, yes, I think there is a microphone. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Really interesting conversation. So Andrew, I have a question for you. You talk about an example of flexibility that the timing for the youth is not the same as the timing for the donor, and can you bring that to life more? Because I'm very curious to hear what do you really mean by that?
Yeah, so I think traditional sometimes donor cycles might fit their fiscal year, so they give you a grant on a January 1 and it ends December 31st. But depending, in this region, when Ramadan falls, that's very disruptive for training, for example, or other hiring cycles. And so with this model, with RBF, there's a lot more flexibility to be able to move the intake, for example, or the seeking of employment to periods where it's going to be most productive.
Thank you. And for that, I guess, important to have also duration of program that is kind of long enough so that you can have time
exactly.
to
and to,
really
to
make
verify
use
the results of
Yeah.
employment. Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah. And one other kind of related too is how one defines retention, and that's critical because we've had one payer who defines retention as staying in the same job, and very often that's just not the case for youth. They end up in a job for 3 months, 4 months, and then they get another job, better job that they move to. And so is that retention or is that not? I mean, that needs to be defined.
But that brings up a really critical aspect in designing these mechanisms is identifying the right markers of success, right? So
Right.
if you identify the wrong metrics,
Exactly.
and this is such a great example of that.
Yeah.
So if your objective is getting youth engaged in employment, then it's and then also aspirationally, if they get better jobs, we should be
course.
incentivizing
Exactly.
that.
Right.
Don't want to block
Absolutely.
their career progression.
Absolutely.
That would be very
Exactly, yeah.
counterproductive. Great. Do we have another question here? Yeah.
Hello, my name is Ahmed. I'm an educator and data analyst at Luminous Education in Jordan. So we talked about education for employment and the challenges we face. I would like to know from your experience, maybe to answer the question again, since you worked in the MENA region, did you face any challenges with employing the refugees in these countries? Some regulations in many countries in the MENA region, they prevent
Sure.
some refugees from working, for example, in technology field.
Exactly.
And that being said, for these people, they can easily maybe get freelancing jobs in the US or in Europe, but maybe they cannot get, for example, a proof employment in this case, right?
Yep.
So did you face this challenge and how you solved it? Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and you're right. I mean, in terms of refugees, there are certain sectors in each country which refugees are allowed to work in, and others which are not. We did not face that particular problem in the results-based finance program because it was focused on other sectors. But I think back to the point, I think the design and the verification of if you're looking at the gig economy or freelance, how would you verify that employment? That would just have to be built in. But yeah, it's a good question.
Thank you. Yeah, one last question maybe here. Oh, actually, we can take maybe both questions and then we'll answer them together.
Hi, good afternoon.
Almost.
Just wanted to ask, when we were talking about, financing people and when they get jobs, not any job, but at a stature where they can pay back the amount. So say in case if just wanted to know, since I'm curious, I wanted to know about if the person, gets these kind of jobs at a later stage, say 10 years down the line, maybe not immediately, because as we know that, the market is down, getting employment, the kind of pay scale that we are expecting is not up to the mark. So if it goes like down the line 10 years or 12 years, so how do you manage these kind of funds? Like, does the amount increase, the value remains the same, stagnant, or you have fixed it, or bad debts we say sometimes which go but never come back? So just wanted to know more about it. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's take the other question and then we can use the last couple of minutes to answer.
to go? Okay. Hi, everyone. I work in the US where outcomes-based financing is moving along at quite a clip. Social finance is doing some really interesting stuff. And what's emerged, at least to my perspective, is that it's large, well-resourced organizations that can take advantage of it. And often those are for-profit. So one of the social impact bonds run by Social Finance has they've partnered with General Assembly as their sort of primary partner. And that's beneficial in the sense that it moves General Assembly towards maybe a different demographic than what they're used to serving, but at the same time it poses risks or potential concerns in terms of the motivations behind the actor. And and I see it potentially as beneficial because they're motivating more capital from different actors, but also potentially risky. So I'm just interested in if you have any thoughts on that, of sort of which organizations social impact bonds or results-based financing should be supporting, whether it's a good opportunity to bring for-profit actors into the space, or whether that's sort of too much of a risk and we should steer clear.
Very interesting question. Thank you. We have very little time left, or none at all. So maybe who wants to take them with?
I can take the first question on student financing.
And maybe Andrew.
Yeah, or you might have a great perspective too. Yeah.
All right. So just to say, in terms of the student financing, it depends then how you've structured actually the initiative. So, but to mainly highlight here. The idea is for the investor to take up the risk. So yes, it is, after a certain period of time, if the, desired outcome is not achieved, the investor does absorb that risk. And those metrics or the parameters for the initiative for success failure need to be defined very carefully, and then, relevant to the specific context, that country, the job prospects there, the specific domain, etc. So there is a potentially shared risk or entire risk transfer to the investor in this case.
And just a note on the other question, I completely agree with the premise of it, and I'm going to skillfully sidestep and say I think the jury's still out, but I will say that it kind of speaks to my earlier point about smaller organizations and nonprofits that may not have the resources up front to be able to implement, whereas for-profits might be better placed to do that. I think it just, again, it's in the mechanism and the agreement how that works. So I think. But
then you can find a risk investor. So for the smaller organizations,
exactly.
Organizations like the Optimist Foundation who can come in when there isn't a balance sheet and provide that upfront capital. So it is possible to engage different sizes and models of organizations.
Yeah.
And maybe to add to this and conclude, I would also say that there is the current state of the market where currently, indeed, maybe the larger, more established organizations can participate, but the idea is also that by developing these type of instruments and taking them to scale, we can bring more organizations into this. And Murad was talking before about the kind of technical assistance that was provided, but that was also technical assistance to the providers, right? The same way that the investor will support the performance management of providers in an impact bond. So over time, we should hopefully see more and more organizations coming into this space, and that can reach impact at a much larger scale. So let's hope that happens. Thank you so much for the very interesting discussion. It's been wonderful to hear about all your experiences. And at the Education Outcomes Fund, as we are launching large-scale outcomes fund programs in the skills for employment sector, we definitely have been learning a lot from all of these lessons learned and experiences. So it's been fascinating to have this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah.